Cinder had always feared the sky. The kingdom nestled between jagged mountains and smoldering plains, a place where storms didn't bring water but flame. Their ancestors had built thick stone temples to guard against the heavens, and their kings ruled through the wisdom of omens. In Cinder, signs mattered more than truth. And no sign was more terrifying than fire that fell without cause. On the night of the storm, the sky did not rumble, it screamed. The stars disappeared behind thick smoke, and flames danced where clouds should be. In a poor hamlet to the east, a woman gave birth in the back of a crumbling granary, with the midwife swatting away sparks and muttering prayers under her breath. The woman did not cry out as the child came. The pain was beyond voice, beyond fear. But the child did scream, and that was what mattered. Her first breath sounded like glass shattering. Her cry did not belong in the throat of something so small. It rose, pierced, echoed through stone, and where it reached, lanterns flickered and hearths burst into sudden flame. The midwife dropped the cloth she'd been holding. The birth had not been normal. The blood was bright and fast burning, and when the child opened her eyes, they reflected the fire outside the way steel reflects lightning. She was not yet named. Cinder believed names must be chosen with care, after the 7th night of life, when omens could be properly read. But this child would not see 7 days. The fires burned for 3 days straight. Fields smoldered, cattle died where they stood, and the rivers boiled down to steam. The storm that had begun the night of her birth did not pass. It only changed direction, circling the valley like a predator stalking its prey. News traveled fast to the capital. Queen Maristela herself summoned the seers, 7 of them draped in ash-colored robes, their mouths stitched shut as a symbol of the wordless wisdom they carried. They stood before the royal court, eyes bleeding from the smoke they'd walked through, and painted a single symbol on the floor in soot. It was the rune for end. "She will bring the fall of bloodlines," one finally whispered through torn stitches. "She will not be ruled. She will not kneel. Where she walks, thrones shall melt." The queen had never been a woman ruled by mercy. Her own rise to power had involved 3 sisters and a series of unfortunate hunting accidents. She did not fear battle or treason. But prophecy struck at the heart of Cinder like a dagger made of truth. "Burn the cradle," she said, "before she is named. Before the omen takes root." No one questioned her. A cadre of the Crown Guard rode east with haste, leaving behind the polished stone of the capital for the scorched roads and trembling villagers of the eastern reaches. The mother was gone, dead, they said, from birthing a monster. The midwife had fled. The child was alone in a hut now warded with salt circles and desperate prayers. They did not touch the baby. No one wanted that mark. They took the entire cradle, wrapping it in chains and setting it atop a cart lined with oilcloth and blessed branches. The child did not cry once during the ride. She simply watched. Villagers gathered on the ridge outside the hamlet, murmuring as the guards built the pyre. It was not just the cradle they set aflame, it was the memory of her, the possibility of her. The seers had called her unnameable, and that made her something beyond human. When the fire caught, it didn't crackle, it roared. White-hot. Unnatural. Birds fled the trees for miles. The sky changed color. And the villagers, all of them, turned their eyes away, not out of mercy but because looking felt like being judged by something old and watching. By nightfall only ash remained. The queen was informed. The seers were silent. The flames died down. It should have ended there. But in the weeks that followed, nothing grew on that hill. Grass blackened. Roots shriveled. The soil itself refused to cool. Rain would not fall on it and animals would not cross near it. Children who wandered too close heard lullabies and smoke. Dreams of fire. Of a girl rising from ash with flame in her hands and no name on her tongue. And in the capital, the queen began to see strange things. A scorch mark on her pillow. Footprints and soot across the marble. And in the mirror, just for an instant, eyes that did not belong to her. Eyes that remembered. The wind carried what remained. Long after the pyre had turned to cinders, when even the embers had cooled to gray whispers, something began to take shape amid the ash. Not footprints, there was no weight in the motion, but a curling, almost hesitant stirring of soot, like smoke remembering a body. And then she rose. Not reborn, not exactly alive. A shape made of scorched earth and breathless fire, her skin ashen, her hair the color of unburned coal. Where her eyes should have been, heat shimmered faintly as if the world bent slightly around her gaze. She made no sound. She bore no name. But she walked, upright, steady, out of the blackened hollow and into the open world. The villagers never spoke of it. Those who glimpsed her turned their faces. They told themselves it was a trick of wind, a story born of guilt and bad sleep. And yet none dared approach the hill again. Even the brave ones, the sword-bearing fools who once laughed at omens, turned their horses away. Something had answered the cradle's burning, and it was walking. Southward she drifted, across the salt flats and sand-blasted rocks of the fire-hollow wastes. Her bare feet left no print, but the wind changed wherever she passed. Birds fell silent. The sun burned hotter. Trees dried at the root and did not recover. She did not eat. She did not sleep. Her silence was not mere muteness, it was a kind of pause in the world itself. It was the desert hermit who found her, or rather let her find him. He lived in a cave halfway between a collapsed temple and a sand-sunk tower, where even lizards no longer dared bask. He had no name himself, only a voice carved by years of dust and ruin. He'd once been a priest of the flame, cast out when his temple fell for asking what fire remembered. Now he whispered to rocks and listened for answers in the wind. She found him sitting cross-legged, his back to the sun, his mouth full of dust songs. She did not speak. She only watched him. "Ah," he said after a long moment. "So the storm has decided to walk on two legs." She tilted her head slightly, like a bird listening for meaning under dirt. He did not ask her name, he could see she carried none. Instead, he brought her water steeped with ash and bitter herbs, and taught her how to listen with skin and breath. He called it the language of wind and flame and stone, the tongue spoken long before words were needed. She learned fast. Not through repetition but through resonance. The wind bent toward her when she raised her hands. Pebbles clicked into patterns under her fingers. A single look could turn a candle to white flame. The hermit never feared her. But sometimes in the long hours between sunfall and starrise, he would whisper to the fire, asking what it wanted of her. "She is made of no one's will," the wind told him once. "Only the memory of a wrong too deep for burial." She built no home, claimed no corner of the desert as her own. She simply walked its heat and let it shape her. Her silence was heavier than thunder. Even the snakes changed course to avoid her shadow. In time, the hermit taught her the final lesson, the one even flame forgot. He stood beneath the noon sun, sweat steaming from his skin, and carved a wordless rune into the dirt with his staff. Then he turned to her, his eyes pale with fire reflection. "This is the truth they feared," he said. "Not that you would burn the world, but that you would never need to." She blinked slowly as if drawing the world into herself. And the air warped around her, not violently but decisively. The sand at her feet turned to glass. A crow overhead burst into white feathers. And the hermit, weeping, dropped to his knees. "You are not ruin," he whispered. "You are the throne that ruin makes room for." She stepped forward, silent as ever, and the wind followed. Behind her, the desert whispered to itself. Something forgotten had begun to remember. They began to call her Sindra, though she never said it aloud. The hermit gave her the name in a dream, ash curling into the shape of a flame that never consumed, a coal that breathed heat but not light. She accepted it not because it was hers, but because she had burned too many things unnamed. But as the years passed, the world seemed less willing to hold her. The desert bent around her as if avoiding the imprint of her presence. The sun itself dimmed above her skin. While others browned and blistered beneath its rays, she remained untouched, pale as drifted ash, her skin neither tanned nor burned. When she stepped into sunlight, it shimmered faintly away from her, like heat rising off stone. Some days the shadows around her grew longer than they should. Sindra grew in silence. She stood taller than the hermit by 12 summers, but she moved like a ghost, a breath that had not finished becoming sound. The crops in nearby soil withered no matter the water or care. Goats miscarried. Hens laid blood-specked eggs. The wind always blew harder when she exhaled. The hermit tried to teach her human kindness, how to offer bread with open hands, how to leave stones as markers so wanderers would not lose their way. But in every village they neared, mothers pulled their children inside. Men held charms carved from scorched wood and muttered prayers for warding. "She's what crawled from the cradle fire," they said. "She's the soot that breathes." Sindra never entered the towns. She stayed at the edge watching. She did not cry when they feared her. But her breath turned cold and the wind changed shape. Then came the ash drawings. At first they were idle sketches, patterns drawn in fire dust with her fingers, forgotten as quickly as they came. But one night, under a high moon, the hermit woke to find them glowing. Not with heat but with memory. The ash curved into spirals, branching like vines or veins, forming symbols older than the city stones. He recognized them. These were glyphs of the sun-forbidden tongue, the one used by the firekin before the gods fell silent. The runes that once named stars not with sound but with purpose. The kind of language that changed what it touched. She had never seen them before. She simply drew them. They came to her like breath, like rhythm in bone. The hermit grew afraid, not of her but of what had chosen her. There are things, he told her one dusk, hands shaking over a bowl of ember tea, that should not live twice. Some fires were never meant to be relit. Sindra only tilted her head, the way she always did when he said something shaped like fear. She began to walk further. Alone. Out into the scorched groves and salted rivers, where even wind dared not sing. There she found the bones of old towers crumbled in shame. The scorched footprints of priests who had lit themselves alight in supplication. She stood over them all and breathed. Where she exhaled, the ash shifted. The bones shimmered. The dead knew her. And they whispered. In time, strangers began to follow her trail, silent ones marked by loss, drawn to the symbols she left behind. They found her drawings etched into the backs of cave walls, traced along riverbeds in soot, glowing faintly in moonlight. Some said her glyphs calmed fevers. Others said they split dreams in two, leaving visions behind. But for every pilgrim that came, a rumor also rose. She walks without shadow, they said in market stalls. She drinks no water and casts no warmth. The sun turns aside. She is not a girl. She is the last breath of a god slain unjustly. Sindra heard none of it. But the air around her knew, and it began to hum. The hermit, now old and half-blind, watched her from afar with sorrow and awe. You were never meant to be soot, he said one last time as she stood on the hill above their cave, eyes reflecting stars in patterns he could not name. But you were born from fire, and fire remembers its shape. She did not answer. But ash rose gently around her feet, drawn upward by windless air, and a distant light flickered, neither sun nor moon. A throne, the hermit whispered in his final breath, must be built from what no one else dares to touch. And she walked on. Queen Malvesa sat on a throne of volcanic glass, sharp-edged and polished to reflect every flicker of flame in the hall. She ruled not with laws but with performance, each decree a spectacle of fire, smoke and controlled destruction. Pyres lit city squares like clockwork, their smoke signals visible from every hill and harbor. To question her was to vanish, burned, erased, swallowed by ash. She was called the flame-crowned, the Red Regent, the sovereign of scorch. But there were names she had buried far deeper than any rebel body. There was one memory she could not scorch, the sound of a baby crying during the firestorm, when the omens came true in the worst possible way. The night her seers fell to their knees, teeth shattered from screaming, warning of a child born wrong, born too close to the gods. A child who might bring down her throne in smoke. Malvesa had not hesitated then. She'd sent masked men to a nameless village, ordered the cradle burned before a name could take root. She'd paid the fire priest twice his price to speak the unblessing. She never looked back. But ashes do not forget. Whispers reached her court like smoke through keyholes. Rumors of ash-scarred travelers passing through border towns. Of children carving spiral sigils into sand. Of people who spoke no prophecy, yet radiated a strange heat. Then came the marks. First, a beggar in the southern square, his back tattooed with a curling brand of soot and ink, shaped like a rising flame threaded through a crescent. He burned alive when the guards tried to detain him and left no bones behind. Next, a girl of 13 in the hill villages, hands blackened by charcoal ink, her eyes glowing dimly in the dark. She was captured, questioned, tortured. She never screamed. The cell caught fire overnight, and all her interrogators were found choking on ash. The ash marks spread. Malvesa summoned her fire seers and demanded answers. They wept as they spoke. The burn mark is not just rebellion. It's memory given form. It is your sin coming to light. She had them thrown into the flame pits. Panic gripped the palace. Noble women began hiding their children. Servants whispered of soot smoke in the halls. Torches flickered near mirrors that showed reflections with ember eyes. Then a noble's daughter was found painting spiral ash symbols on the walls of her bedchamber, whispering a name no one remembered. Sindra. 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 The queen ordered a purge. It began with tattoos. Anyone found with a spiral or soot mark was dragged into the open square and bound to the pyres. Artists were questioned, their ink supplies burned. Temple fires were consecrated to purify the kingdom of whatever this uprising was. But it was not an uprising. Not yet. It was a haunting. Ash reappeared in places she had scoured clean, beneath her goblet, in her slippers, inside her pillows. She once unrolled a scroll only to find the words smeared with soot in the shape of a single, smoking glyph. She burned entire libraries to silence them. Truth is a trick of memory, she told her advisors. Burn it and you burn the lie. But the people stopped believing her. Some watched the burnings with bowed heads, mouthing not prayers to Malvesa, but to the ash. One night, her mirror cracked in 3 places as she stared into it. The flame behind her flickered, then went still. She saw not herself, but a girl-shaped figure standing in a cradle of fire. She did not sleep after that. The ash marks, it was said, began to pulse. On skin, on walls, even in the veins of riverbeds. The sigils were not just symbols now, they glowed when the moon was high. They hummed near old firesides. They moved slightly like something living. When Malvesa ordered another wave of executions, the flames did not rise on command. She stood before the pyre herself, torch in hand, and the fire refused to burn. It was then her High Inquisitor told her in a shaking voice, "The fire does not serve you anymore. It remembers what you did. It has chosen someone else." The queen slapped him and left the chamber trembling. The next morning she found the throne hall flooded with soot. Not wind-blown, not spilled, but deliberate. Spiral shapes scrawled from fireplace to stairwell. The air thickened with heatless smoke. Her guards swore they heard breathing in the walls. She ordered the entire staff changed out. She forbade any mention of ash, soot, or spiral. But the truth had already caught flame. And in the northern desert, far from her palace pyres, a figure in ash-wrapped robes walked toward the capital, silent and slow. The wind curved around her, carrying smoke and memory. Sindra stepped barefoot across fields where nothing grew, where the ground was blackened and brittle beneath her toes. She left no prints. The earth recognized her, not as trespasser, not as survivor, but as heir. The wind moved with her, rising and falling with her breath. Where others would choke on smoke, she inhaled it like air. Her skin drank the warmth of scorched stone without blister or break. She was not flame. She was what came after. The ash walk began in the outskirts of Cinder, where the fire pits from the early purges still glowed faintly. The villagers there whispered legends of ghosts, of girls turned to smoke. When they saw her, they did not scream. They fell to their knees, not in worship, but in a grief too old for words. Cinder did not speak. She never had. But she listened. She walked among the charred remains of altars, hearths, and homes where rebels had been burned. From each site she gathered what was left. Handfuls of ash, fragments of charred bone, sometimes a tooth or a blackened ring still bearing the sigil of a forgotten house. The ashes clung to her willingly, forming lines along her arms, patterns across her shoulders. She did not wash them away. At the third village, an old woman approached her with tears on her cheeks and fingers caked in soot. "I saw them burn my son," she whispered, voice cracking. "I screamed for him until I tore my throat. All that was left of him blew away." Sindra touched the ground beside the broken pyre. The wind coiled inward, tightening, and then there was a sound, a low sigh, like the last breath of a long-extinguished flame. The old woman fell to her knees and wept. In the days that followed, Sindra walked alone, but she was never unaccompanied. The ashes gathered behind her like a cloak, trailing in her wake. The wind carried dust and bone fragments in spirals, forming shapes that flickered in and out of view. At night, the ashes seemed to hum with warmth, like a lullaby sung in smoke. Villagers began to follow. They did not chant her name. Most did not know it. But they followed the path of soot, the scent of embers. Some came barefoot, others carried urns from their family hearths. A boy carried the scorched sword of his father, still fused to bone. A mother clutched the burned doll of a daughter lost to the queen's purges. They walked in silence as she did. Words had long since failed them. In one town the guards tried to stop her. They raised their pikes and shouted orders, but their torches refused to stay lit. One soldier dropped his blade the moment her eyes met his. Another began to cough uncontrollably, falling to his knees as black dust spilled from his mouth. The others fled. That night, the villagers buried their dead for the first time in years. Sindra stood at the edge of the cemetery, and the ashes around her pulsed like breath. Further along her path, she came to the ruins of a cathedral the queen had burned for harboring dissent. Cinders still clung to its broken archways. Inside, birds nested in what had once been choir lofts. Sindra stepped into the center of the nave, placed her palm against the scorched stone, and the entire ruin exhaled a gust of warm wind that scattered feathers and soot like rain. The birds fled. The ash glowed faintly. The bones beneath the altar wept. As the crowd behind her grew, the skies above Cinder darkened. Not with storm but with the weight of remembrance. Clouds formed in spiraling shapes. Lightning arced without thunder. The wind carried her forward, always forward. By the time she reached the borderlands of the royal province, she was more symbol than girl. Her cloak of ash trailed 20 feet behind her, rising and falling like breath. Children walked in step with her, their hands marked by soot. Elders carried stories instead of weapons. None of them spoke but all of them knew. They called her the Emberborn, the burnt air, the crownless flame. At a river where 100 rebels had been drowned in molten tar, Sindra knelt and cupped the black water. It did not boil. The river stilled. A breeze whispered through the nearby trees, and a flock of crows took flight in perfect silence. When she stood, the ash on her skin had deepened to charcoal, and a second trail, of mist and heat, began to follow her. She no longer needed maps. The wind knew where the palace was. And so the ash walk continued. Villagers lit no torches in her presence. They brought no songs. Their tribute was memory and silence, grief and witness. In every town more joined. Some brought ash to smear on their faces. Others carried bowls of soot to anoint her path. She said nothing. But when the moon rose and silvered the land, the ashes swirled upward, and her cloak billowed like wings. The queen's messengers who tried to intercept her were never seen again. At dusk on the 7th day, Sindra crossed into the lands where the palace spires rose like jagged teeth against the red sky. The wind grew hot. The trees leaned away. The soil began to crumble into dust. Sindra walked calmly, steadily, her eyes reflecting every fire the queen had ever lit. The ashwalk was nearly done. Cinder had long been a kingdom of fire, but never before had it forgotten how to breathe. It began slowly, at first no one noticed. A haze that clung to the farthest fields, blamed on a dry season. A thin layer of soot on rooftops swept away without thought. The priests declared it a natural trial, a cleansing offered by the gods of flame. But soon the sun itself dimmed, veiled behind a thickening curtain of smoke that rose not from hearths or pyres, but from the ground itself. The wind no longer moved. At midday the skies hung a bruised gray, and by dusk, the horizon glowed with a sickly orange light, fire not of passion but of slow suffocation. The crops began to curl in on themselves. Wheat stalks blackened before ripening. Fruit split open on the vine, oozing ash. Farmers returned home with coughing fits and blackened fingernails. Water tasted of cinder. Still the queen did not waver. More rites, she commanded, her voice sharp with smoke. More fire, more prayer. The temples lit their highest braziers. The great flame spire in the capital blazed for 3 nights and 3 days. Livestock were offered. Then rebels. Then whole villages were marked for burning, cleansings, the queen called them, with holy fire to chase out the curse that gripped the land. But the more they burned, the worse it became. The smoke thickened. Black flakes drifted even in sealed chambers. The royal court began to wear perfumed cloths over their faces. Some whispered that the queen no longer slept in the palace, but deep beneath it, where fire could still be controlled. She claimed visions told her the fires must grow hotter to purify the kingdom. In secret, the nobles sent envoys across the sea. They begged for seed, for rain charms, for anything that might dispel the smoke. Nothing worked. Even foreign aid blackened upon entry to Cinder's borders. Birds fell from the sky mid-flight. Midwives spoke of stillborn infants with scorched lungs. Still her name was not spoken. No one said Sindra. They spoke of omens, of disobedience, of fire gods grown wrathful. But in the alleys and undercrofts, children whispered of a girl who wore ashes as a mantle. They drew spirals and soot and crossed their fingers when the wind passed. The oldest beggars claimed they had seen her walking the scorched roads, barefoot, unburned, wrapped in silence. And then the dreams began. At first they were subtle, a flicker of shadow behind a door, a pressure in the lungs during sleep. But as the smoke deepened, so did the visions. Nobles woke screaming, drenched in sweat, remembering only one thing: a girl of ash standing still, always facing the palace. She never moved, never spoke. She only watched. The court's dream priest collapsed on the 3rd night of visions, blood dripping from his ears. He had written a single sentence on his chamber wall before his death: "She waits in the breath between fires." No one knew what it meant, but the queen ordered his chambers sealed. Meanwhile, commoners began refusing the fire rites. Some fled to the borders. Others extinguished hearths entirely, lighting no flame, boiling no water, cooking nothing. They claimed it made the air clearer. They called it the silent breath. In time, an entire village refused to burn their dead, burying them in soil for the first time in centuries. That village vanished overnight. When scouts went to investigate, they found only scorched shoes at every doorstep. No bodies. Just shoes still upright pointing east, toward the palace. The queen's paranoia grew. She surrounded herself with fire wardens, covered in ceremonial oil and flame robes. Her throne was elevated, lifted above a burning floor so that no shadow could touch her. She slept beside open pyres. The palace was lit like a sun at midnight, but the smoke found its way inside all the same. Her advisors tried to calm her, tried to suggest restraint. She dismissed them. Some vanished. Others burned in accidental blazes that seemed to leap from no source. But even her most loyal guards began to twitch in their sleep. Some walked at night without memory. One tried to carve a spiral into the throne room floor with his dagger before biting off his own tongue. And still the dreams came. Sindra, though no one dared name her, was always the same, a girl wrapped in ash standing still in the fog of a kingdom that had forgotten air. She did not speak. She did not blink. She simply watched, her shadow stretching toward the heart of the palace. Soon her image appeared even when people were awake. In soot-stained mirrors. In the silhouettes behind steam. In the gaps between flames. The queen summoned her seers, those few who had not fled or died. They stood in a circle of fire and tried to summon a vision of the coming days. Only one of them survived. He came out blind, his mouth filled with cinders. He whispered through cracked lips. She will not scream. She will not burn. She will only walk. The queen ordered a new purge, a final cleansing of every town still rumored to whisper her name. The soldiers marched into smoke so thick they could barely see. None returned. And then one dawn the wind blew again. It carried not freshness but memory. Sharp bone. A low hum that stirred old grief like coals beneath forgotten embers. Cinder had choked itself in trying to forget her. And now she was coming. The air was different there. Not cleaner, not clearer, just older. It carried the scent of burnt cedar and charred cloth, the ghost of a scream once loosed into a firestorm and never truly quieted. The cradle grounds, long abandoned, had become a place no one dared to name. No crops grew there. No birds nested. The trees along its border leaned away, as though recoiling from the memory that clung to the earth like soot. But Sindra walked it like sacred ground. She had returned with the silence of dust and the weight of all those who had burned behind her. Her cloak of ash drifted around her shoulders, trailing along the blackened soil, and the air around her flickered, heat shimmer without flame. The ground remembered her. It knew the rhythm of her breath, the hum of her presence. And it responded. From the center of the clearing, where once a wooden cradle had been stacked with dry tinder, the earth began to shift. The soil convulsed, not violently, not with eruption, but with remembrance. Beneath Sindra's bare feet, ash compressed into something dense, something deliberate. Bone fragments stirred in their burial, drawn like iron filings to a magnet. They moved toward one another, shaping themselves without hand or tool. The wind curled in around them, swirling with the intensity of a breath held too long. A throne began to form. Not a seat of comfort or luxury, but one built of burden and sacrifice. Ash fused with bone and bone with blackened stone. Ribs formed the armrests. Vertebrae wound into the back. The seat itself seemed to breathe heat without flame, pulsing with silent purpose. No crown rested atop it, but a spiral of scorched marks, seared into the stones behind, declared its authority louder than trumpets ever could. Sindra stepped forward and sat. There was no ceremony. No herald. No word spoken. Just the low groan of the earth as it shifted beneath her weight, as if even the land bowed in recognition. Her feet touched the blackened soil, and the moment she settled onto the throne, the wind changed direction. It howled. It screamed across mountains, tore through valleys, whistled through the gaps in broken windows and the cracks in temple spires. In cities and villages across Cinder, the people turned their faces to the wind. Children awoke crying, sensing something in their bones they had no words for. Old women covered their fire pits. Priests dropped their censers mid-prayer. From the four corners of the realm, the marked began to rise. They had always existed, quietly, cautiously. Ashbirth children who healed too quickly or burned too brightly. Outcasts with soot-colored scars or flickering breath. Survivors of fire who never coughed smoke. They had wandered alone, unloved, told by terrified parents or trembling village lords to stay hidden, to stay silent. Now they felt the call. The spiral that had haunted their dreams now stirred in the air. Their blood ran hot. Their feet moved before thought could catch them. From desert edges, mountain hollows and smoking valleys they began to walk. They left behind lives of fear and shadow and made their way toward the place of black soil and silence. Some traveled days. Others walked for weeks. But they all followed the same wind. Sindra waited. Her hands rested on the ash throne, her gaze steady and distant, as though seeing more than the world in front of her. Around her, the ground glowed faintly with the pressure of too much memory, of fire denied, of pain unspoken. The first to arrive was a girl no older than 7, carrying a bundle of soot-wrapped bones. Her eyes shimmered with smoke. She did not speak. She knelt at the foot of the throne and placed the bundle before Sindra. Then she bowed. The next was a scarred woman with burn-scrawled arms. She wept without sound and lay her sword, melted, warped, at Sindra's feet. Then came an old man coughing embers. He dropped to his knees and offered a piece of parchment, half-burnt, with a name still visible, Cradle Child. One by one they gathered. The throne was no longer just a seat. It was a signal. A wound reopening not to fester, but to bleed out the lies buried beneath centuries of fire worship and fear. Sindra did not speak. She did not need to. The wind carried her silence into every hearth and palace, into the deepest cellars and highest towers. It whispered to queens and rebels alike. It stirred the ashes in every fireplace, blackened every royal banner, kissed the brows of infants born with flickering eyes. The cradle had been burned to destroy her. Now it was her seat of power. By twilight, a ring of the marked stood around her, wordless, solemn, radiant with heat and memory. Behind them, the horizon glowed. Not with flame but with potential. The throne of ash and bone would not be approached by kings or claimed by warlords. It belonged to silence. It belonged to her. The queen's palace stood high above the capital, its golden towers long meant to dazzle and dominate. But now they darkened. Black dust drifted down from the sky in slow, endless spirals, coating the marble steps, the iron gates, the silk banners hung from windows like proud tongues. Servants swept it away, but it returned faster than they could breathe. It crept into lungs. It clung to lashes. It gathered in the folds of courtly robes like a mourning veil no one dared name. Inside the throne hall, courtiers whispered between coughing fits. One by one their white gloves turned gray. One by one their eyes began to water, their voices to tremble. Fire, once the queen's most sacred tool, refused to light. Candles guttered. Torches sputtered. The great brazier at the heart of the chamber, where dancers once spun in its glow, sat cold. Queen Malvesa paced before her throne, draped in flame-threaded finery. But the hem of her gown dragged the dust like a curse. Her hands trembled as she raised them to the air, summoning flame with the sacred sigil. Nothing. Not even a spark. She tried again. And again. A whisper passed through the court, not from lips but from the stone. A dry sound like breath on bone. It curled around the queen's feet and traveled through her ribcage like smoke in a flue. Her body shuddered. "My power is not gone," she said aloud to no one. "The rites are intact. The seals hold. The fire obeys." But the fire did not obey. Not anymore. Behind her, one of her advisors collapsed mid-step. Blood stained the front of his fine robes, bright against the gray. He clawed at his throat. Another woman doubled over, wheezing, black dust pouring from her mouth. Panic rippled, elegant and stifled, as the court attempted to flee in measured dignity, tripping over their own feet in their desperation. The queen turned to the guards. "Seal the gates. If this is poison, it will not follow me." But the gates would not open. The great levers had turned to rust. The bronze hinges groaned, unmoving. The road beyond the walls, once gleaming white stone, had cracked into blackened rubble. The sky dimmed, though the hour was barely past noon. And then the air changed. It shifted as if remembering something long forgotten, something older than kings or queens. Something buried and burned and not quite dead. The hall fell silent. The dust paused midair, suspended. The queen froze. At the far end of the throne room, where no door had opened, where no guards had announced her, Sindra stood. She wore no crown. No armor. No silken robes. Her feet were bare, blackened by ash and memory. Her hair floated gently, lifted by a breeze that touched no one else. Her cloak, woven from smoke and silence, dragged behind her like a storm cloud stitched with grief. Her eyes burned, not with light but with understanding. She stepped forward once and the dust parted before her. The queen backed up instinctively. "You are no child of this court. You were extinguished. I saw it myself. I gave the order." Sindra said nothing. She tilted her head, and a trickle of gray fell from her cloak. The throne itself groaned behind the queen, as if ashamed to stand in her presence. "I did what I had to," the queen snapped. "The omens your birth was a warning. You would have undone everything." Sindra opened her left hand. In her palm was a single coal, red as a still-beating heart. It pulsed once. The queen staggered. Her chest convulsed. She tried to speak, to issue a command, a plea, a curse, but her voice caught in her throat. Her eyes widened. Her fingers clawed at the collar of her gown. Smoke began to stream from her mouth, from her ears, from beneath her fingernails. "No, no, this isn't," she gasped. Her flesh began to glow from the inside, faintly at first, then brighter. Like paper held above a flame just before it blackens. Her skin blistered without touch. Her golden crown dropped to the floor with a dull clang, and she collapsed beside it. There were no screams. There was only the scent of burnt silk and secrets. Sindra turned slowly. The court, what remained of it, stood transfixed, too afraid to move, too awed to breathe. Some knelt. Others wept. A few, blessed with old memory, pressed their foreheads to the ashen stone. She did not speak. She had never needed to. With a final look at the scorched throne and the blood-spotted marble, she walked through the blackened hall. The gates that had refused the queen now swung wide at her approach, groaning not in protest but in reverence. Behind her, the queen's ashes scattered into the wind. The court would remember this day, not as an ending but as a reckoning. The throne no longer looked like one. Where once gilded arches and red velvet formed the seat of Cinder's rule, now stood a jagged monument of fused bone, scorched gold, and soot-hardened ash. The wind never touched it. The light never settled on it. And though no fire had been set since the queen's fall, the ground around it steamed faintly, as if exhaling the breath of something long buried and restless. Sindra sat upon it not as a queen but as a question no one dared answer. She did not move. She did not command. She did not even blink, it was said, though no one could look long enough to confirm. Her cloak, stitched from the dust of every flame she had passed, hung around her like the remains of a storm caught mid-collapse. Her eyes were coals without fire, black but never cold. Words spread faster than horses or ravens. The capital, once called Salvalen, was renamed without vote or decree. Ashend, the people called it, first in whispers, then in songs, then in etched markings on maps. Ashend, the place where fire learned fear. Ashend, the city of the throne no one approached. No laws were posted. No decrees issued. Yet the realm obeyed. Bandits who had pillaged the southern valleys vanished once they crossed the old king road toward Ashend. A warlord from the eastern wastes marched with 200 blood sworn and was found weeks later weeping, blind, speaking only the word forgiven, over and over until he drowned in his own tears. A fire sorceress from across the salt seas, bold with crown magic and anger, flew in on wings of phoenix feathers, only for her flight to spiral into smoke before she reached the outer spires. She burned mid-air. Her scream did not echo. None crossed the boundary twice. The people adapted. Traders left their goods outside the soot lines and returned home richer than before. Messages were carved into obsidian tablets and left under stone markers. In return, seeds arrived, ash-colored and smooth, that when planted bloomed into black-petaled flowers with healing scent and slow-burning leaves. Sindra never responded in words. She never rose from the throne. But the wind around her shifted when someone approached the border of her dominion. Not with menace, but with a testing memory. And that was enough. Across Cinder, old customs were abandoned. Temples that once offered flame prayers now stood silent, the altars cold. Children born beneath fire signs were marked not with fear but reverence. Many were named after the one they would never see, only feel in the tremor of dry earth or the breathless hush of a hearth gone dark. Some called her the Ember Saint. Others the Ash Mother. The wind that would not bow. The last fire. The never-burning flame. But none used the name Sindra lightly, and those who did spoke it only once, then buried the word in salt and soot. In time, a new kind of map emerged, one that did not mark borders with ink or rivers or roads, but with zones of heat. The outer ring warmth. Say, crops grew. Trees flowered. Life hummed. Closer in, the still warm fields. Soil like breath. Days that passed with heavy silence. No birds. No insects. Just wind. Then the soot-blown ring. Ash fell like snow. Trees stood dead, their bark peeling in black curls. Voices echoed oddly. People did not linger here. They passed with reverence, torches unlit. And finally the heart, Ashend. City of silence. The throne of no return. No one ruled Ashend. Sindra did not hold court. She did not answer to council or clergy. She never named successors. She never permitted offerings, nor worship, nor rituals. Yet none dared threaten her. None even wished to. And still she sat. Some said she had become more ash than flesh. Others swore they saw her weep smoke only once, when a child left a singed toy at the border. Others claimed that when the stars fell, they paused above Ash End before vanishing. Years passed. The world changed. The highlands saw frost for the first time in a century. The western isles cracked and floated toward the sea. Empires rose and fell, and still the throne sat beneath the darkened sky of Ash End untouched. Invaders turned away before reaching the borders. Explorers lost direction. None mapped what lay beyond. Once a child, braver than most, crossed the soot line barefoot and unblinking. The wind did not push him back. He walked until he saw her. He did not kneel. He only raised one hand, palm open. And she raised hers in reply. He turned and left with gray on his lashes and a smile that glowed like coal. He never spoke of what he saw, but he became a healer, and no flame ever harmed him again. The throne of no return remains. Not because no one can approach it, but because everyone now knows they should not. Generations passed, and with them memory frayed, but not entirely. While other stories bent with time changed names and meanings, the tale of the girl born in fire, the cradle burned in fear, and the ash-formed throne that no one dared approach remained steady. It lived not in books or proclamations, but in the spaces between breaths, in the way elders hushed their voices near certain winds, and in the hush that settled when the word Ash End was spoken aloud. Ash End never vanished, but neither did it grow. Its stone arches, blackened long ago, stood untouched. Moss did not dare root there. Birds flew over but never landed. It did not age. It simply was a still, unmoving center in a world that pressed on around it. Crops were sown and reaped in outer fields. Cities rose on the far edges of the kingdom. Trade routes curved around Ash End like water around stone. Maps marked its boundary with a single word, etched in warning, Ashline. The ashline was not a wall but a place where the air changed. To cross it was not forbidden but unthinkable. The ash grew finer there, white like frost but warm to the touch. Wind moved without sound. Voices dulled to whispers no matter how loud they were spoken. It was said that to speak a lie upon the ashline was to lose your tongue. Most never tested it. Pilgrims came, not to enter but to leave. They brought objects, feathers charred by candlelight, bowls of soot from family hearths, bones of those lost to fire. Offerings were placed with care upon the ground at the edge of the ashline. No shrine stood there, no altar. Yet sometimes the wind scattered the offerings. Other times they remained for days untouched. That was considered a sign. Either way she had noticed. No one knew if she was still there. Some claimed to have seen a figure on the far horizon, blurred in heat shimmer, watching from the throne of ash. Others heard breathing in their dreams, dry and steady as desert wind. There were no messages, no edicts. Only the silence and what it allowed. Children born under fire moons, those rare nights when red washed the sky and the air smelled faintly of ember, were brought to the ashline as part of a new rite. Parents guided them forward until their feet touched the edge and then stopped. The child would reach down and touch the ashen earth, and in that moment tradition held they would be marked, never by sight, never by sound, but by a knowing. Some of those children became healers. Others builders. Some disappeared entirely, walking into distant lands with strange eyes and quiet conviction. None of them feared fire. The faith of flame was gone. No more burnings. No more offerings of oil and spark. Temples that once praised the sun were now open to the wind. Statues of queens long dead were quietly taken down. Their metal was melted not for war but for tools to tend the land. Even in distant kingdoms, whispers of Ash End shaped choices. Generals refused scorched earth campaigns. Rulers thought twice before burning enemy crops. Fire was still used, but always with apology, always with care. A new reverence had formed around heat. Not fear. Not worship. But respect. They called this era the Ashline Age. It was not named by decree but simply emerged, like all true names do, from need. It meant many things. The line no one crossed, the balance between power and humility, the reminder that destruction once cast away can still take root and grow. It was an age not ruled by kings or queens but by caution, memory, and shadow. There were scholars who tried to study Ash End. Some left instruments at the ashline to measure pressure, temperature, vibration. Most failed. Their devices corroded or fell silent. A few captured results they dared not publish. Patterns in the ash that formed letters in dead languages, bones rearranged into warnings. One account spoke of a song heard through stone, but the researcher who wrote it vanished 2 days later, leaving only soot where his bed had been. So they stopped trying. Instead they listened. The ash line was taught in schools. Not as a myth but as a line in the ground, a lesson carved in generations. Children learned not only about the girl who had once been burned, but about the fear that led to her burning, the fire that birthed her throne, and the silence that followed. In time, other kingdoms sent emissaries, not to claim but to ask. They brought gifts: glass cooled by breath, ink made from volcanic soot, sculptures shaped from scorched stone. The emissaries stood at the ash line and waited. Sometimes the wind took the gifts. Sometimes it returned them, unbroken but changed. One day, a child stepped across the ash line. They were not stopped. They walked a single circle around the edge, scooped a handful of ash, placed it in a cloth and walked back. Their eyes glowed faintly red for the rest of their life, but they never said why. And still she sat. Or perhaps she no longer did. Perhaps she had walked beyond her own throne, become part of the storm beneath the earth. Perhaps she had left her presence like a handprint pressed into time. No one knew. No one asked. Because some truths are too sacred for inquiry. Some names burn longer than fire. Some thrones rule not by force, but by memory. And so, the people remembered. Quietly. Carefully. Every child learned the final line by heart. Not from a book, but from their elders' lips, passed like flame from wick to wick. They burned her cradle in fear, but her ashes formed a throne no one dared approach.